Well, ladies and gentlemen, we do have a major report to get to here today. Donald Trump plans to reevaluate the country's role with NATO. We've also got JD Vance suggesting US could drop support for NATO if Europe tries to regulate Elon Musk's platforms. And we know that Europe, many of the leaders there were hoping and praying for a Democrat win for a number of different reasons. The Musk idea is one of them. Obviously, with Donald Trump winning, Musk is only going to gain more power, and they're really trying to control platforms. We know what happened in Britain, where people went to jail for tweeting out emojis, that entire thing with all the immigrants. That's only one component. The bigger component is the NATO factor, and many of these European countries like the way Democrats approach NATO. They don't really like the way Republicans, specifically this new wave of Republicans, the MAGA, under Trump, it's more of an America first thing, and we're sitting there wondering, you go back to NATO when it was created in 1949 versus where we are now. Democrats approach this agreement like all of the countries are equal, when that is certainly not the case. The United States by far is going to have to do the most heavy lifting if a war were to break out in Europe and one of the NATO countries gets involved in it or gets invaded. You've got Article 5 in the United States is immediately, according to NATO, they have to help that country. And if you're Trump, it doesn't make any sense. When this formed in 49, it's totally understandable, and we still want to have a relationship with the countries in Europe. We've got military bases there, but if you leave NATO, you can still have those bases because those bases are not under the NATO umbrella. It's something completely different. And you can see this Politico article saying the law is not airtight in terms of Trump possibly trying to get out of NATO through maybe presidential authority. I believe that's what the article is talking about there. So this is something that could happen. Would Trump leave NATO? Where would that leave us with Europe? I think we would still certainly have relations with the European countries. The big issue is, and this is even a bigger problem now with what's happened with Russia and Ukraine, it's more and more of these smaller countries trying to join NATO to where it becomes a liability. If one of these small countries, something happens to them, you have to do Article 5, and it makes it a significantly bigger war. It almost escalates things, and that's what Putin is trying to argue, the idea of escalation. And you always use the Mexico comparison. If they've got, maybe an Axis agreement between China, Russia, India, North Korea, Iraq, and then you bring Mexico into it, you think the United States would care about that? If Mexico had relations with all those countries and they had basically an anti-NATO agreement, with basically the same thing but with different countries, I think it'd be a huge problem. So you can understand what Russia is thinking when it comes to NATO and how far they're expanding. And obviously those smaller countries in Europe, this is as obvious as ever. You want the United States protection. It makes you significantly harder to invade because if the country invades you, they're going to be having to deal with the United States. But if you're the United States, you really don't want to have to be obliged to help a smaller country in Europe and forced to send stuff if a war were to break out. And then on top of that, you've got the United States, the world's biggest military, involved. And now you're automatically potentially talking about a bigger war because now you're going to have other countries like China possibly thinking the United States is distracted. Maybe they try and take Taiwan. It's a very, very complicated situation. And I understand the idea of NATO. I also understand Trump's point. Listen, Trump totally bullied the European countries back during his first term when they weren't contributing at least 2% of their GDP to the military budget of their countries, and he got them to do it. There's actually some Europeans that are happy this is happening with Trump coming back in because they're saying we shouldn't be reliant on the United States. See, with the Democrats, it's like they're the sugar daddy to all these European countries because the Democrats, they treat all the countries the same. With Trump, he's like, no, if you look at the military budgets combined, the United States is 77% of the total NATO military budget. If you add all of the countries together, the United States alone is at 77%. And I will be, when you're talking about war versus military budget, those are two different things. Just because we have this crazy military budget doesn't mean we're going to win every war. If something happens, it's going to help significantly, but people have to also detach that. The people think you look at our military budget, we're going to crush everyone. That's not really how it works. We've seen that, several times in other countries. But either way, when it comes to something like this, it very clearly is Trump thinking in an America first way versus the Democrats more of a passive, laissez-faire, we're just all in this together. And the way NATO has aged, has been, I would say, very poor for the United States. Again, I understand in 1949 doing that, you've got the USSR right on Europe's doorstep. You could say in Europe with the amount of countries that they had at the time in Eastern Europe right after the fall of Germany. But at the same time, it's like, look at where we're at right now compared to 1949. You look at Russia, they're a lot less powerful, even though they invaded Ukraine. It's like the whole idea, these European countries are crying, well, Russia's just going to take over Europe. Well, then maybe you should arm yourselves better. And by the way, they haven't even made it into Kiev. How are they going to take over Europe? A lot of this is fear-mongering. So for the United States, we would be able to keep our military bases in those European countries if we wanted to, and even if we left NATO. So for Trump, we'll see what ends up happening with NATO. But the issue is NATO, which originally was, supposed to be this anti-war agreement. And I understand what it facilitates. And if a smaller country joins NATO, they've got the protection of the United States. So any country invading them, it's going to be a lot harder. I get that. But at the same time, that also causes escalation if that ends up happening. So the idea of it's like, does the United States really have to protect Finland? Why doesn't the EU just protect Finland? Do you really think Russia's going to trample over the entire EU? I mean, that's pathetic if that happens. You should arm yourselves better. And again, there are a lot of people within Europe that are happy that Trump is back, and not all of them. Most of them, the governments are not, because the governments understand you get the Democratic leadership. They're like the big dummies who are like, we're all equal, we're just going to, and that's one of the things that Biden and they all say, they're like, well, Trump treats NATO badly. All Trump did was say, you need to pay your fair share. Trump didn't do anything really other than say that. And he also did threaten to leave NATO back in like 2018, but it never ended up happening. And you would think it would be maybe easier to leave NATO potentially using presidential authority now. That you have a lot more control. Trump with the popular vote win, and also with the House, slight House control, and really, really good Senate. You've got like 55, 56 Republicans, I think, or maybe 54. I think Kerry Lake lost. But either way, when it comes to NATO, this is clearly Trump just examining the agreement and understanding this agreement has really not aged well for us. Now, if the United States, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, if they all had similar military budgets, this would be something that would be very beneficial for all parties, but they don't. We've got a significantly bigger military budget. And that's why I said, this is what I would propose. Let's just make a tax on these countries. If they want the United States support in a military agreement because of how strong we are, I mean, we protect you. It's going to be very hard for a country to invade. You need to pay us like 0.10% of your GDP or something. Okay, because listen, we're going out there, we're protecting Finland. If we do that and we have to go to war now with our massive military, we need something in return for that. We're not just going to do this, in 1949 that was fine, but now it's a little bit different. So that's why I would say maybe a tax on these countries might be the best thing. And if they don't want to do it, they can just have their own European Union. And maybe Britain can join back into the EU or something to fortify that. So listen, we'll see what ends up happening with NATO, but in general, we knew this was going to happen. Trump was going to look over NATO. There's going to be some problems with NATO. There's a lot of leaders, European leaders, that don't like Trump. Europe is I wouldn't say very left-wing. They're definitely left-wing, but there are some countries like France. They had their elections. The Liberals won, but it was closer, and the same thing happened in the UK. The Liberal parties won, the Labour Party won, but now the Labour Party's got an approval rating of like 20%. Canada is turning slightly more right-wing, we hope. And obviously Canada would be a totally, they're also in NATO, but it'd be a totally separate agreement with them to where we share a continent, so it's different. But either way, guys, when it comes to this situation, it is understandable that Trump would reevaluate this. The least we can do is at least force the other countries to pay 2%. Although I'm going to be honest with you guys, it really doesn't matter, because even if they pay 2% of their GDP, the United States has such a bigger GDP. That's why the budget, and listen, with any military agreement, because the United States is so massive, it's going to look lopsided. But with NATO in specific, you've got all these smaller countries. And yeah, would it be a win to get them to pay their 2% or 2.5% if you want to bump it up? I guess so. But again, it's just the United States is so massive. Does it really make sense to where we're tethered to going to fight for a lot. I mean, there were liberals that wanted Ukraine to join. It was an emergency thing that Zelensky wanted, joining NATO while he was fighting Russia. What are you talking about? So we're immediately just going to enter World War III and thankfully NATO was like, absolutely not. That's not going to happen. But I already think it's in the NATO law where you cannot be in an active war and join NATO. Because then it's just all of the NATO countries are going to have to defend the one country that joins. And the other thing is you got all these smaller countries. It's a big problem. But this whole thing, we'll see what happens. Do I think Trump's going to leave NATO? I think it's going to be very hard. I think it's going to be very, very hard based on our relationships with those European countries. I think this thing is, let's get them to pay more. Trump's probably going to do a victory lap. I would imagine is going to examine the amount of authority he has now with the Supreme Court and potentially trying to expand those powers. That's why liberals got so nervous. They're like, you can't let Trump in. He's got the Supreme Court now. Well, Trump's in and he won the popular vote too. So he's got mass authority. But we'll see if, how expansive those powers can be to where maybe he can use it to get out of NATO if he wants to. I think a better deal for the United States is, listen, we can have relations with these European countries, but if they want us to defend them, there's going to have to be some form of reward for the United States, because this is a different continent we're talking about. Obviously, Germany is going to care significantly with what's going on in Ukraine. Look at how close how close they are located to them. It makes total sense. If something happened with Canada, we would be like, yeah, we're going to be involved in this event. Canada's right to our north, and Germany probably wouldn't care too much. So it's like now, because we're in NATO, something that was originally agreed to in 1949, we have to care as much as Germany and these other European countries about what's going on with Russia and Ukraine when we're located with an entire ocean and another continent separating us from the actual event that's going on. That doesn't make too much sense. And look, when it comes down to it, we understand what this is all about with Putin. I know there's some Republicans saying, well, he doesn't want to reform the Soviet Union. I think it's only human. They lost a lot of land in 91. They want some of it back. Let's just call it what it is. And they also, and this part is fair, they want the NATO expansion to stop. And it's already gone too far. And Biden takes credit like a victory lap. Well, that caused this whole thing. When you expand an agreement like that, that's already involving the most powerful country on earth, there's going to be problems with an adversary, especially if you've got that agreement, a country right next to you sharing a land border, potentially trying to join it. There's going to be big issues with that. So the entire situation is something to watch. There's a lot of moving parts with it, but I do think this war with Russia and Ukraine will get solved, and the mainstream media is going to swing it as Trump is appeasing Putin because he's going to give him land, because Putin is going to take land. That's, if any peace deal is happening, they're going to get land, and they're going to connect Crimea to their territory. And that's just the reality of it. They've wasted too many soldiers. They're not going to go back. And if they were to go back, that would involve escalation from NATO countries into forcing them back with their own ground soldiers, which is a whole nother story that nobody wants. Not even the European countries want it. But the problem is, and this is what Trump really needs to articulate to the American people, the idea that we would care as much as a Germany about what's going on in Europe, in Eastern Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Asia, that we would care about that is ridiculous. Now, if it was something was happening in Canada, absolutely, based on where they're located. But we're in such an amazing spot right here. I'm not saying let's be bullheaded and let's just let Russia take over all of Europe. They haven't shown anywhere close to the capacity to where they could do something like that. Nowhere close. And it's not, we've sent them money, but other European countries have sent them money as well. But when you're talking about this event in Europe, the United States has a very cordial relationship with these European countries. We do not mind helping because we've got our military bases there and we want some influence when it comes to the world stage. We understand we are the most powerful country in the world, but at the same point, maybe it's the European countries that need to come together. And this is why some people within Europe are like, maybe it's better Trump is president now because we're going to be forced to spend more. Rather than this whole Democrat, like, oh, yay, you just do whatever you want. Oh, you didn't hit your 2%. That's all right. It's okay. You get a star. You get a little sticker. It's like the Democrat rule And Trump's like, no, I want what's best for America. We're in this military agreement. We're the number one superpower by far in this agreement. And we want people to at least contribute their fair share to what the agreement says, which is 2% of GDP to military budget. And listen, if Trump gets ultimate power, he can say, no, this is ridiculous. We want a tax from you if you want our protection, because we're the number one military in the world and we're the strongest. And if you don't want it, that's fine. We can have other deals separately with individual countries, like the bigger countries, and we'll leave the smaller countries out of it. And then you've also got this JD Vance talking about dropping support for NATO because of them potentially regulating Elon Musk's platforms. Elon's got to be one of the happiest people in the world, the fact that Trump won versus what would happen if the Democrats won. And Elon's got some serious power now because he's right with that administration. You don't want to look too far into it, but you see like these family photos with the Trumps and Musk is in them. And obviously he's the richest person in the world. He has extreme power. Musk does right now. He stuck his neck out on the line. He endorsed Trump. He was at the rallies. That takes a risk. I mean, I guess at that point, it really wasn't, because the left already hated him. But there's a loyalty there that I'm sure Trump is definitely going to give Musk and his company some serious favorable treatment because of this. And it's going to allow Musk to have more power in terms of what he wants done and what he asks to get done when it comes to the United States government allowing it. Remember, they slowed the SpaceX thing. They said, there's all these things you have to watch out for. Well, I think it's going to be hyperspeed now with Musk, now that Trump is in, and with his influence, with executive authority. It'll be interesting to see Musk build his companies with basically the support of the president. So guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.